So, ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to you. We will slowly get started because we have a busy and fascinating day ahead of us. So, welcome to the conference on reviving long-term growth in the European Union, role of productivity-enhancing policies. So this is really the conference that we always wanted to organize. And we wanted to organize this because of importance of productivity issues and the way that they seem to be underplayed in the public debate. This is the time to think about productivity issues, not just in terms of where we are in the EU cycle. That's sort of the most pressing issue for a lot of us in the room. We just had the new leadership elected. We are preparing the new cycle. And we are thinking a lot about how productivity should be anchored more strongly in the EU policy framework from the European semester onwards. So if you don't factor productivity in now, then when would you do it? It's not an easy discussion because productivity captures a complex set of trends in the economy. It encompasses a multiple set of drivers. And we will examine some of them today. We've selected, as you saw in the program, 3 to focus on: knowledge transfer and diffusion, business dynamism, and digitalisation. This is by no means the entire territory, but these are the issues which we found most relevant at this stage. Before I introduce our keynote speakers, let me share with you a few logistical points. So this is an on-the-record discussion. We will be live tweeting during the day and filming the sessions. We will put the recording on our website later. The dedicated conference hashtag is Boosting Productivity EU, as you can see on the screen behind me as well. Finally, there will be time for questions and answers during the day, and you have as well the opportunity to use Slido and put forward questions to the moderator, and you see the codes as well on the screen. So I could not think of 2 better suited keynote speakers today to provide us with the intellectual starting points for a discussion on how to revive productivity growth in Europe. And I'm delighted to welcome to the stage Dr. Adam Posen and Dirk Pilat. Dr. Adam Posen is the president of the Peterson Institute in Washington, D.C., one of the world's foremost economists. Under his leadership, Peterson Institute has been ranked the top economic think tank in the world in many surveys. Prior to joining Peterson, Adam had been on the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England and was named by The Atlantic as one of the global superstar central bankers in 2012. Now, Adam has just co-edited a major study entitled Facing Up to Low Productivity Growth, and is one of the most pertinent international voices on the question. Dirk Pilat is Deputy Director of the OECD's Directorate for Science, Technology and Innovation. And when you think productivity in Europe, you often think first Dirk Pilat, because of the pioneering work he has done over the years, going all the way back to his PhD on productivity at the University of Groningen. He has also led Going Digital, the OECD initiative that has looked at the impact of digital technology on society, and we are delighted to have him with us. So Adam, over to you. It is the 4th of July, so best wishes on the Independence Day. May the United States shine again, if I can put it that way. And you can speak from here, you can speak from there as you wish.
Thank you all very much for welcoming a wandering American. I am very proud of my own and the Peterson Institute's continued work with the European Commission, and I'm very grateful to Pavel Svoboda and his colleagues at the EPSC for engaging us in this important project. It is a bit weird to be here on July 4th, but you don't have tanks in the streets, so you're doing something right and we're doing something wrong. Bitter jokes aside, I think that is a broader point that can be made, that Europe has the opportunity in many ways to do things right, including on the boosting of its own productivity growth, irrespective of and to some degree in contrast of the mistakes that the US is making. That's of course not the reason one does it, but that may actually help define the debate in some ways. As Pavel kindly mentioned, German Zettelmeyer and I led a project called Facing Up to Lower Productivity Growth, which starts with the premise that the low productivity growth we've seen throughout the advanced economies is not something that is going to go away anytime soon. Now, this may be mistaken. As my grandmother would say, we should be so lucky. If it turns out that productivity growth exogenously jumps up on average across the major economies, great. But we believe that, and I will speak in the first person from here on because I take responsibility for what I say. I believe that, unfortunately, that is not something one should count on or even expect. The fact that productivity growth slowed across the Western world and Japan almost simultaneously, by macroeconomic time series standards, very simultaneously, that it did so before the financial crisis, that it has persisted as low productivity growth since the financial crisis, even though thankfully it has perked up a bit, and that it cut across countries in the OECD, essentially not changing the ordinal ranking. There are a couple exceptions, but basically if you had ranked the OECD countries by average TFP or labor productivity growth, it's simply all downshifts. And so this combination of very blunt facts leads me, and I think rightly many others, to say this is something that is some kind of technological shock or general global shock. It is not just the policy follies or the social actions or the experience of crisis, which would differ from country to country. Now, if we take that as given, and there's obviously a lot of discussion can be had about the causes of productivity growth and why this is the case, but for today's discussion, let's take that as given. And then we should think about, as Jeremy and I argued, borrowing a concept from climate change, we should think about adaptation as well as mitigation. So for those of you familiar with the climate literature, the idea is, you can try, whether it's through carbon capture and storage, whether it's through seeding clouds, whether it's through successful prayers to the beings above, to keep global warming from happening. You also, particularly if you're in an exposed sector, have some responsibility and need to adapt to the reality that global warming is occurring, or I shouldn't say global warming, climate change is occurring. And we would argue similarly, there is an issue in productivity growth that one can try to reverse the ongoing trend, the global slowdown at the frontier, but one can also try to think about how to adapt to a world in which trend productivity growth is lower. The difference with climate change, which is actually a positive one, of course, is that there is very little trade-off between what you do to adapt versus what you do to mitigate. Many of the strategies we will talk about, or I will briefly touch on, I should say, and then will be developed by many other experts through the course of today's conference, are things that might well help the productivity trend overall, but which certainly can help one adapt and make the most of the productivity growth you have. It's not like the moral hazard one sometimes has in climate change policies, where if you're adapting, you're enabling more emissions. We don't have that trade-off here. So one should be realistic but one should not be overly, excessively pessimistic. And so I will speak now from sort of a macro top-down perspective, partly because that's my background, but partly because I would not want to challenge Dr. Pilat and his team on their expertise on more of the micro and technological issues. So I think the way to capture the productivity slowdown and the adaptation point for our countries, and particularly in Europe, is essentially the decline of dynamism. That when we look at the corporate sector around the world, when we look at the performance of economies, it has become increasingly clear that a lot of it has to do with how much competitive pressure there is on private business and how much competitive pressure there is that allows reallocation of resources, of human talent, of capital between firms, not just between industries. So a number of researchers, including my former PIE colleague Carolyn Freund, and starting with the Harvard theoretician Mark Mellitz, have documented the fact that in a large number of industries you have superstar firms that are the right tail, say, of the distribution, for whom most of the exporting, most of the top-end productivity growth comes. And part of what needs to happen in any given economy is the proper reallocation to those firms. But it is also equally obvious and important that anytime you get large firms, whether they get there through merit, through inheritance, through political action or whatever, there presents a difficult problem when how do you govern those firms? That they still allow for entry of others? That they still behave in a competitive fashion? That they still generate what they did when they were coming up? And in our book, Facing Up to Lower Productivity Growth, we have an interesting piece by Jason Furman and Peter Orzag that looks at this. Obviously, this has become a very important field here in Brussels and in academia. I would just stress that too big to fail is not just a financial sector issue, it is also a non-financial sector issue. I have been on record saying that Boeing and its problems, are to me an example of too big to fail, that you're in an environment where there's only the two major airframe manufacturers, it's seen as a national interest by the US, you don't get competition, and you get, in fact, loss of human life in this case. So this is a very critical issue, and it is obviously not trivial to decide what is the appropriate antitrust or competitiveness approach to things like the Facebooks and Googles and so on of the world. But I would stress that national champions generally are a bad idea, whether it's Boeing in the US or whether it's various attempts in Europe to have maybe not national but European champions. The issue ultimately is how you use the technologies that are out there, not whose label is on it, particularly in a world where taxation of multinational corporations is, we hope, being improved in part through efforts of the European Union and the OECD. So just to say that it's not just about big either in terms of if they're big, they must be good, or it's good to have someone who's big. You need to think in a more rich way about competitive dynamics, and there are other experts here who can talk about this. A second point in this regard of dynamism is to think about trade, and here, frankly, is one of those places where the contrast between the EU being a force for progress for its own and the world's sake, and the US not, is become very clear. I had the privilege to meet with EU Commissioner Malmström yesterday and congratulated her and her team on the accomplishments of the EU-Mercosur and the EU-Vietnam deals. So I'm not going to belabor the point. EU obviously gets it. But the ability to have scale in markets as opposed to scale in companies, the ability to have a wider range of competition, the ability to have the flow of ideas, these are the things that ultimately will help with dynamism and long-term growth. We have a new paper from the Peterson Institute by my colleague Douglas Irwin that takes on directly some of the claims made by Danny Roderick and others of less academic seriousness than Danny about trade not really doing things for growth. And Douglas has a new review of the literature. It shows very conclusively, empirically, that trade liberalization does help growth. But thirdly, I think turning now very specifically to Europe, I hope I'm not over time yet, turning very specifically to the European challenges beyond the broad principles, I want to make a few specific points. First is I want to commend the EPSC and Pavel and colleagues for this title, Reviving Long-Term Growth. Language matters. It matters for what the bureaucracy and the technocrats focus on, and it matters for how you can build up public support for an initiative. And it is important not to talk about productivity per se, partly because it is only a means to an end, and partly because it is a concept that some people find difficult. Because ultimately, if you're honest about productivity, it's measured as a residual. It can sound like it's all about worker displacement. It's not, but it can sound that way. And then you can get bogged down in all kinds of issues of measurement. So it's important, this is why I chose the term dynamism. You can talk about competition, but preferably competition, not competitiveness. But mostly just to say it's about long-term growth, and then just one more sentence to remind people, growth isn't just about accumulation of stuff. It's about how well you use that stuff. That's really what we mean by productivity. But the other point going with the language that's here and which isn't on the screen is the word innovation. That again is something that's motherhood and apple pie, that's a very July 4th reference. I won't try to fix it for this audience. It's something that everyone can attest as wonderful, which of course has political advantages, but also, frankly, is what we're about and what we need to focus on. So I think the language focus here is very important. But secondly, if we think about it in the innovation or dynamism context, I think what Europe has to sell, and Europe meaning the Commission, the governing bodies, what it has to sell is buying very expensive lottery tickets. That if you take the view of the world and the productivity slowdown I mentioned, one way of explaining it, which I think has a lot of merit, unfortunately, is the sort of Robert Gordon, Robert Solow view that there is no next big thing, to use Michael Lewis's phrase, that there isn't at present a general use innovative technology that's just advancing the whole frontier. Now, those of you who have particular technological interests and expertise may strongly disagree with me, and you can say, around the corner genomics or 3D printing or automation or AI or 1,000 things that I am completely ignorant about are going to turn out to change things. And again, we should be so lucky. If that happens, that's a much better problem to have because that should lead to trend productivity growth. But if we assume, to use the economics speak, that this has been an exogenous downshift in growth, that it's some kind of negative technology shock or the technology trend overall in the economy has gone down, then there's no absolute sure way you can get it back. But what you can do is, as I said, buy lottery tickets. You can invest a lot in education. You can invest a lot in broad technologies. You can invest a lot in R&D. You can invest a lot in human capital. And these are better lottery tickets than you usually buy. I was briefly on vacation in northern Spain in the Basque Country a week and a half ago, and I guess it's time for one of the lotteries in Spain, and everyone's out there selling their little lottery tickets, and if you're from the US, you can play Megabucks, which of course is a great name for America right now. You can play Megabucks, and the odds are 1 in several million, 1 in hundreds of millions. Realistically speaking, the odds of these kinds of investments from a public goods perspective are more like 1 in 50, 1 in 100, arguably as low as 1 in 1,000 at worst. And when one thinks about that, that's actually a very good bet if you're a risk-neutral portfolio manager, and which is what the European public investment, however you define it, should be. And so there is a political economy challenge of selling people on the idea that some of the stuff we put money into isn't going to have a visible immediate benefit, or some of it may actually lead to companies and projects that fail. We've seen the problem in the US under Obama, where there was investment in a couple green technologies that went bust. We've seen specific examples in the European context where people complain about that. That is, I think, the public relations challenge that responsible long-term European policymakers have to confront, that the responsible thing to do is to buy a lot of lottery tickets in this way and accept that not all of them will pay off. But one that pays off enormously. The next point I would make is linking that to such institutional structures that I know the EPSC and many speaking today will be talking about, like the European semester and other institutions. And when we think about the European semester, if you're in Brussels, you think about it as a very important convening and disciplining process. If you're in Athens or Rome, you may think about it as getting nagged again about fiscal and structural reform. I think the way to integrate some of the productivity innovation speech into the European semester is, again, to focus not on this magical hated word of structural reform, but to try to put a fresh spin legitimately on the idea this is about dynamism. And this isn't about necessarily the fiscal balance in the short term, this is about what you're getting for your money. And that will frankly have a lot to do with continued service sector deregulation and continued improvement of labor market mobility within countries and across countries in Europe. Third, I know we're going to get discussion later today from an Irish colleague and from others about these national councils. I think this can be very useful, and the OECD, of course, plays some of this role as well in a context beyond Europe, which is to identify in a country-specific way what are the aspects that are choking off dynamism or that are interfering with full development. Again, the danger and the risk, all of you who've experienced this process on either side of the table, is you end up with sort of the laundry list approach, and everybody just gives you the ideal wish list in some Milton Friedman, Leon Walrus ideal world. How do you deviate from it, and give you 100 things. And we all understand the political dynamics behind that. But I think this is where this project that the EPSC, and I hope the European leadership takes up, becomes important, is that you should be looking at this through the lens of innovation and being able to prioritize matters which involve these investments, the labor market mobility, the emphasis on retraining, and the emphasis on a proper form of competition and openness to competition, and that you can concentrate your remarks, and there are many things you don't have to talk about because either they're beyond an individual nation state's control or because, like with trade, they're done at the European level. Finally, returning to my sort of more short-term macro roots, the productivity slowdown, or in a particular formulation of it, as Larry Summers puts it, the secular stagnation we face, it means that we are facing a world we have seen, and it looks like we will continue to see, of low interest rates, low inflation, low trend growth. And again, there's a very rich discussion to be had about why, how much demographics matter, and so on. But taking that as the reality for the next 1, 2, possibly 5 years, and the near certainty that we will face a new recession in Europe within a couple years that is in that environment, one cannot forswear the cyclical aspect of this entirely. And as was made clear at the ECB conference at Sintra a couple weeks ago, where I participated, as was made clear at the G20 in Osaka, where, thank God, I did not participate, we are in a world where monetary policy is not on its own going to be able to offset the next recession, full stop. And I say that as a former central banker and as someone who's considered an advocate of monetary activism. And so I think the final point I would make to this group is that we need to think about capturing what will inevitably come as the fiscal boost, the fiscal spending, which may come too late, but which will come, and channeling it in a way that is innovation friendly. And that work has to start now. And in my view, the way to think about it is thinking in terms of public investment, much grander scale, frankly, than the Juncker plan. Thinking about that under the rubric of something green, not to be too cynical, but you need an umbrella for your work, and there will be, of course, all kinds of things under the heading of Green New Deal, Deal New Green, that may not be ideal, but which at least would have some beneficial thrust if you at least try to put it in that direction, as well as political help. And that in particular, going back to something of the lottery tickets idea, but also the fiscal realities now, this has to be thought of as primarily a set of public investments. I can make the case, perhaps not as well, but reasonably well as most economists, about why a carbon tax would be good. I can make the case not as well as some experts, but with great fervor for certain kinds of regulation. But ultimately, this is going to be about deep policy stimulus from the fiscal side in coming years, and we need to capture it and channel it in a way that is both pro-sustainability and pro-innovation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Adam, for both providing us with the intellectual framework for thinking about productivity. This mitigation adaptation concept, I think, is extremely telling, hard to design. We already have a question on Slido, how to balance fiscal caution with risk-taking. And if you allow me, I'll want to come back to this in the discussion. And then you took us into the existential territory of what happens when the next slowdown comes and how well equipped we are. So thank you for your thoughts. And now I invite Derek to share with us his thinking about the new productivity paradox.
Thank you, Pavel, and very much good to be here, and always good to come to Brussels and talk a little bit about some of our work. Partly also, you said my history about productivity. Well, partly productivity is something that seems to trail me a little bit. I don't work on productivity most of the time, but it is an issue which you encounter a lot. My main responsibilities are around innovation, digital economy, and so on. And then also you start thinking all the time about productivity and why it matters. And I think it is really central to so many things, and I very much agree with Adam Posen on that. I had a few slides, so if I can have those, it would be helpful, just partly because I think it's perhaps good to put a few numbers on the table, just to give people a little bit of an idea on what is going on. We very much see within, I think, across countries that productivity has slowed down across almost all countries, which we're looking at. Basically, you have most of the OECD countries here. Even actually starting before the crisis, in many cases, productivity has slowed down. It even accentuated even further if you're looking since the crisis, because before the crisis was mainly about multi-factor productivity growth. After the crisis, we've also had a decline in investment, which has led to lower overall labor productivity. Now, there's a lot of debate about this. Where is this coming from? Why is it occurring? This is a slide which I think we've used a few times in the OECD work, because basically you have these, to some extent, you have the optimist and the pessimist there, the pessimist, which I think most people know, is Robert Gordon, who basically says, well, everything useful has pretty much been invented. There's nothing else on the horizon. There will be not that much more to come. And then you have people who say, well, there's still quite a lot in the pipeline. We may see a bit of a slowdown right now, but things will pick up again at some point in time. Though I probably agree with Adam Posen, it might never come back to some of the high levels we had before. There are many explanations out there. I don't want to take you through the literature, but there are many different explanations out there why this is occurring, why we've seen this slow down. Some people say, well, this is partly because of technology is slowing down. One example, for instance, we have Moore's Law, which is basically, for those of you knowing a little bit about digital economy, basically, we are basically being able to put a lot more transistors on a chip, and which basically has led to higher speed of processing and everything. Now we need about 15 times as many research, basically, to keep that process going that we did in the 1970s. So in a sense, the effort needed to make this acceleration still possible is more difficult, perhaps, than it's been before. Now, that may change. One of the issues we're currently looking at the OECD is artificial intelligence, where perhaps there may be opportunities to accelerate that process again, but it is an issue that is coming up in many cases. The other one, which I think is a big one, is around the fact that perhaps we are seeing this a bit of a slowdown, and we had a big meeting in Sydney 2 weeks ago, the Global Forum on Productivity, where we bring countries together to talk about productivity, where some people say, well, actually what we're seeing at the moment, we're seeing a slowdown because there is so much introduction of new technologies, and it just takes time to adjust to that. It is difficult, and at that time we actually see a slowdown, but at some point in time we will see this bounce back come in the productivity numbers. I wanted to say one word about is the measurement question, because it typically comes up. People say, well, isn't it all measurement? We're just missing a lot of it. Well, not if you're really looking at the GDP story, if the part of the economy which we're able to measure in terms of gross domestic product. Actually, if we would probably adjust for many of the measurements, the problem would be even bigger. At least that's one of the things we heard a little bit. What is important, there is a lot are the things which we currently see in the economy in terms around the digital economy, we just don't measure. And there are some really interesting studies out there at the moment where people are trying to measure the utility of having WhatsApp or being on Facebook or using Google and things like that, which suggests there's a lot of what we call, economists call consumer surplus out there, which we basically just don't measure in terms of measured GDP. So there's a story there, but it doesn't help us explaining what we're seeing. Now, our contribution has more been at the OECD, and Chiara here, my colleague, will come later in, but she's been one of the main people working on this topic, is basically to break this down a little bit, because the aggregate story, basically looking at the macro perspective, it's actually hard to figure out what's really happening. So we've been trying to break things down a little bit and look at the micro perspective. We've done a couple of different ways of looking at it. This is one of the last ones coming from some of my colleagues, where basically it says, well, actually the slowdown is not occurring everywhere. It's not occurring in every part of the economy. There's still a lot of leading firms in the economy that are still doing very well in terms of overall productivity. So they're still able to turn perhaps also some of the new technological opportunities into productivity growth. It's just the other part of the economy, a large part of the economy, which means that basically the aggregate doesn't move much or is slowing down, is not able to keep up. So we have this divergence in productivity between the leaders and the laggards, which means that things are not going as well as we'd like at the aggregate level. Now, the big question then is basically, what do you do about that? And the way we've started to look at that a little bit in the OECD is basically that to say, well, we need to look beyond this aggregate. And if you're looking at an economy, probably you have leading firms. These are some of the big innovators. That's where a lot of the new ideas come from. That's where a lot of things happen, where a lot of new ideas and technologies are being commercialized. You want those to do that. You want them to move ahead. But then you also want it to diffuse to other firms. You want it to move, and some of these technologies, but also the processes, the organizational ideas, the process changes, you want them to move to other firms in the economy. So the question is, well, how well is that occurring? How well is that happening? And the second part is this reallocation, and Posen mentioned it already. You want to see this reallocation because basically what happens, what you would like to see happening, that the firms that are figuring this out, how to do this, you want them to grow. You want them to gain market share, and you want the firms that have difficulties figuring it out slowly perhaps to exit the market, because that will really help the whole process. That will lead to overall productivity growth. The problem is a little bit, both of those factors are not doing as well as we would like them to see, and that's where some of the issues come from. I don't want to go into this. I mean, I think, again, the slowdown is a little bit puzzling because we have all these technologies coming our way at the moment. We're talking about lots of technological changes at the moment, so many happening pretty much at the same time. Lots of technologies that we didn't even talk about 3 or 4 years ago, artificial intelligence. It was not a word that was mentioned in the discussions, but now people talk about it because it's happening and it's occurring, and we see that with many other technologies that are coming forward at the same time. So we are again in a little bit in the context of a new productivity paradox, and there was this productivity paradox in the 80s. Robert Solow wrote, like, why do we see computers everywhere but not in the productivity statistics? And to some extent we're seeing the same thing happening again. And if you're looking at some of the historical work on this, people basically say, well, there's probably been a productivity paradox over the years, and it's happened before. Now, we've mainly focused on these two parts, this lack of diffusion of technology and innovation. I think one of the issues I think is important to stress, I think we often talk too much about the technology. I think we focus too much on the fact that technology is there, and technology is maybe the easy part. Technology is the part you can often buy a technology, you can license a technology, you can get it in your company. What is much harder is basically to make it work in your own context. So to adapt your organization, to adapt your business models, to adapt your processes, to adapt skills, to adapt management. All of those things are much more difficult and take a lot more time. And that, I think, is one of the things which is often ignored in the discussion because we say, oh, well, all this technology is coming our way. But technology is often, I think, the easy part. So what we see in the data is basically that there is still a large potential for technology. We have these data coming from work from Eurostat and also from the OECD, where we have these surveys of businesses across countries, which allow us to look at, well, how is this moving ahead? We see still very big differences across countries. We also see very big differences across firms within countries, where often the smaller firms are not really moving ahead very quickly. And sometimes we don't know where it's coming from. And just to give you one example, cloud computing, which is basically you outsource some of your business processes to another provider, to another firm. Amazon Web Services is one example. There are others. It is something which potentially is extremely attractive for small firms, because it basically allows the larger firm to do lots of things for you. But we see massive difference across OECD countries. In Finland, about 70% of firms are using it. In Germany, it's only about 10 or 15% of firms. So the question is, well, why is this happening? Why do we see this lack of diffusion across different countries? The second factor, and Adam Posen again touched on this already, is this issue of business dynamism, where we see really a decline in business dynamism across many countries. Puzzle is he also here that even larger decline in business dynamism in some of the most digitally intensive sectors of the economy, where entry rates are going down, where also sort of fewer jobs are being reallocated. And that means that basically we don't have this sort of reallocation within the economy as much as we would like it to happen. And that's important, because I think that's where things are happening from. We've done a bit of work on policy factors as well. I won't go into detail, but I wanted to say a few words in the end, just to wrap up and leave some time for discussion, is just to say a little bit about, well, where are we, at least in our work on this debate? I think first, well, this diffusion is still underway. It will take more time if we want to really see an aggregate pickup in productivity. And there are questions about, well, what can we do to accelerate the diffusion? My second point, and again, I stress it, it's not only about technology. I think we're often too much focused on technology. We need to look at these other things, and because they are much more difficult, they take much more time within companies than the technology itself. The adjustment is costly. It may take time. It also can be something that is actually slowing down productivity. And if you look historically, and I guess Eric Bartels may touch on that perhaps later as well, it is something that has occurred in the past. Structural change, this reallocation, is extremely important. It is not something which is occurring. And we also see some other features here that need to be looked at in terms of the pace of structural reform. The good news is a little bit that, well, perhaps even these impacts may still come. We may still see this pick up if we are able to bring more firms on board, if we are able to accelerate this structural change, and perhaps if some of these technologies start to feed through into the process. Will we get back to 2% productivity growth? Probably not. Perhaps we've had this real phase of very high productivity growth, but perhaps we may be so lucky. So we'll see. It's very hard to predict this, and particularly because productivity is actually residual. It's something which we just measure in a certain way. I think there are things that policy can do. One is the strengthening of innovation, where I think, for instance, there's a lot of focus on also how things like artificial intelligence could help speed up research productivity, because basically one of the things, for instance, you can do with artificial intelligence, the difficulty for researchers is you can only read about 100, 200 papers a year. Artificial intelligence can read 50,000 papers in a short while and give you sort of condense things down to some cases. There are things you can do with this technology in terms of searching, moving things ahead, which could possibly accelerate productivity. So these are things which we're starting to look at in some of our own work. Investment, again, I think is an important one. What more can we do around that? Diffusion, I think an issue which probably needs more attention on the policy agenda. What does that actually mean? What does it actually mean about diffusion policies? What are some of the things that actually can happen around that? Because it's crucially important, but we still probably have difficulty figuring out what actually to do about this. Is this just about good framework conditions? Is it just about a good business environment? Or are there things that governments can actually do? We heard a fascinating presentation in Sydney about the role of management, for instance, where good management can really sort of help to also sort of bring new processes into a company. But again, the question is, well, what can policy actually do around management? It's a tough one. I mentioned that a second ago. Structural change, I think there are some new dimensions here as well. We have, with this new wave of technologies, particularly digital technologies, we have other sectors of the economy which could be changed quite fundamentally. Education, health, other sectors of the economy, which we don't talk much about in terms of structural changes, but where there may be new possibilities for new ways of doing things, which I think need to be thought about a little bit more. Scaling of firms, a big issue still in the European context. We have lots of great startups, but they don't scale very well. European single market, digital single market, still not entirely there, but those are important things, I think, to keep on. And then finally, regulation, where I think also there are lots of questions about what does good regulation actually mean in a digital context? What do you do about this? How do you regulate? When do you regulate? What are some of the issues around that? And then the competition agenda, where new dimensions are starting to come up in that context as well, where lots of questions about what does all of this digital change mean for the economy? Few thoughts. Some of them I think are clearly and squarely already on the EU agenda. Some others probably could do with a little bit more attention in terms of driving the agenda forward. So let me leave it with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dirk. You hinted at being a technological optimist, even though you've qualified that throughout what you had to say. And it's true that when you think about the potential of the technologies which are emerging today, I mean, it's hard to assume for a moment that they cannot have a positive impact on productivity. I mean, AI being as pervasive as it is, would be highly surprising if it didn't produce productivity boosts. But at the same time, Robert Gordon, whom you've cited, makes this distinction between pace of innovation and the impact of innovation on the economy. And obviously, these are not necessarily two same things. We will have a few minutes for discussion, so welcome your questions. I have a couple on Slido, which I want to refer to as well. But let me perhaps start by asking both of you about this mitigation adaptation paradigm, which I find extremely important, because a lot of what we do is mitigation. I mean, if you look at the program today, it's mitigation until the concluding panel, perhaps. So we are in the business of trying to fuel these positive dynamic forces in the economy, and that's surely our prime task. But Adam is right in drawing attention to the fact that if it is a permanent slowdown, and I think you, Dirk, you have largely agreed with that, then we also need to think about adaptation. Now, my question is there a natural synergy between the two? Or is there a risk that if we focus too much of our attention on adaptation, we basically presume that slowdown will continue, and therefore we will pay less attention than necessary to mitigating actions? So you need to take this, yeah.
So
and it needs to be on.
On.
So, yeah.
On? Okay, yes. Let me say a couple things, and then Dirk can take on a different paradigm. I think the adaptation mitigation idea that we put forward, and that I appreciate you're picking upon, maps kind of well to some of what Dirk and his colleagues at OECD have been doing, in the sense that there is the pace of, or what you were just saying, Pavel. There's the pace of frontier innovation, literally what technologies are advancing, and then there's the issues of diffusion and adaptation of the technology throughout the society. And I think one way to think of it is to focus on the policies that promote the adaptation, the wider spread of technologies, the lack of capture of technology or standstill of technology by dominant incumbent players, the adaptation for small and medium enterprises. So just 3 points on that. First, confession, when I talk about lottery tickets and when I talk about the fiscal side, that is indeed more on the mitigation than the adaptation side. And so in my remarks, I didn't quite get to where it should have been in the spirit you're talking about. And I think second point is one of the slides that Dirk put up and that Celia and other OECD colleagues have done great work on is documenting at the micro firm level that a lot of this is about lack of diffusion. So you had the slide with the various technologies about what share of EU businesses have already adopted them. This is a critical point, and so there are policies you can try to improve that process, and in the EU, there are intervention tools. The third thing I would say, though, and this is the disturbing chart that, again, Dirk had in the slide deck, and we've seen in it's great OECD work, so we've seen it many times, is the idea of the divergence between the leading firms and the rest of the firms, but that it is a similar level of diversion, a similar gap, let's say, for, he had a slide with two figures. One was the non-digital firms, essentially. And so this, as much as we like to think of this as AI and all these sort of hot, sexy topics, it is something that is inherently going on. I shouldn't say inherently. It is something that is going on across a range of sectors. And some of the work we published also, and work obviously in discussion with the OECD that the Council of Economic Advisors in the US did under Jason Furman, also goes to this, that either the definition of what's a winner-take-all or network industry goes well beyond digital, or just generally there is a problem in the diffusion. And so the final point I want to make is, and this is more difficult for EU to explicitly take on, or not EEC certainly to explicitly take on, is that there is a political economy aspect here, that there is something wrong with our societies, the way they're handling change right now, and the political support for change. And in that list, that slide that Dirk gave with the list of literature, and I'm too lazy, but I would have come up with much the same list. You know, he mentions a study that looks at the accumulation of rent-seeking, as economists put it, and political economy regulatory barriers coming up. And I think that that is also part of where the Commission and the EU have to think differently about what they portray things. That it's not, as the Anglo-Saxon press would have it, regulations from Brussels, it's Brussels breaking up barriers to dynamism and barriers to competition.
Just to add a few things. I mean, I don't think there's a contradiction between the two agendas in my mind. I mean, I think a lot of what the mitigation agenda is partly about is also, I think, improving the way the economy works and so on, which I think is in any case will be good for adaptation as well. So I think, but there are other elements. I mean, I think just to try and take you through the agenda, what does it mean if we have an economy where also we will have aging populations, we have labor force growth, which will be going down in many countries. So we will probably have lower GDP growth and GDP per capita growth. What does that mean for other things? Now that's what the book is really about. So I don't want to take any of it away from you. But I think there are some key things which we need to think about. We've seen some of our work. I mean, the OECD does every year something called Going for Growth, where we try to assess a little bit where we are in the structural reform agenda. But we typically see that many countries' structural reform has really slowed down. And I think there are, and the question is, well, why is that occurring? And what is this resistance to structural reform? Or is it just becoming more difficult for governments to do it? Are we some of the low-hanging fruit has been done. Perhaps it's getting more complicated. So I think that's another element here of the discussion. There's also a link to, and we heard about climate change. There's also a link here to the whole climate change discussion to some extent as well. What does that mean for lower growth? How do we deal with that also in the sustainability discussion? So, more to do around this. This is, I think, also the book by Adam Posen and Jeremy and Settelmeyer will be something I think is for us as well to do more thinking around.
Thank you so much. I would look around the room if there are questions coming from the audience. I've received a few on Slido. Is heterogeneity in firms necessarily bad, or is it merely a natural feature of how productivity and innovation capacity are distributed in the market?
I would say it's not necessarily a bad thing. I think it's normal. You have differences in how firms perform, how management performs. Lots of reasons why we typically see this very different distribution of firm performance. I think the challenge is a little bit. There's not even a problem if you have leaders and laggards. The problem is a little bit if you don't have the resource allocation in the economy to move from the laggards to the leaders, then you have this possible stagnation in your economy. And what we're seeing in some countries that there's also been a growth of real laggards at the bottom that are not moving, that are still there, that don't seem to exit the market. And that again helps, will lead to this extra slowdown in productivity. So I don't think it's a bad thing. It's just something where you need a few other things to happen to make it work.
And maybe just,
No, sorry, just let me agree, but state it a little differently. At any time, any given moment, you snap a picture in cross-section, you should expect heterogeneity between firms, leaders, and laggards. But over time, in time series or in dynamic terms, you should expect turnover in who is the leader and who is the laggard. And I think the concern is more about the lack of change over time.
and this relates to another question which has come up, namely, why is diffusion slower today than it has been in the past? What is different?
That is the big question, and I think we've probably pointed to a few things that may matter, but I don't think we quite understand that. I think the dynamism of the economy may be one role, may play maybe one factor in it, because the interesting thing is also that we've seen some barriers come down that are important for diffusion. I mean, trade barriers, for instance, have come down. Trade is an important component in all of this as well, because that's how a lot of technology knowledge diffuses as well. There are some things that have happened in the economy. There's also, we had a good discussion in Sydney as well, for instance, on some of the things that may slow down mobility in the labor market in some countries, which it plays an important role in diffusion as well. So there are some things that probably contribute, but we don't, I think, understand the full picture of all the different things that and their respective roles.
Another important aspect of this discussion is the regional dimension, namely technology, I think, was widely expected to lift all boats across the board. If you had access to the internet, you were supposed to be able to take part in the global market. Clearly, this has not been the case. There is an agglomeration effect. So innovation focuses in places. So we had a question, how does that relate to the regional cohesion?
That's an important dimension which we're trying to look at as well. And I think there is a lot of focus on trying to also strengthen capabilities at the regional level, which I think can help. But you do have an inherent tendency for things to cluster in cities sometimes, in certain centers where things are happening. And in some cases, you probably will need that as well. It makes sense to have certain things come together. So again, you get to a question about how do you perhaps bring some of those other parts of the economy on board. But we also see people moving more and more to areas where there is work, where there is jobs, where there are higher incomes, and not an easy one, and a very difficult one, I think, to get the balance on.
Pavel and I were actually talking about this a bit yesterday. I take as writ what was just said, that there are inherent, this time I do mean the word inherent, there are inherent forces that lead to what produces essentially the urban-rural divide, and it varies somewhat from country to country how that's expressed politically. But the idea that the cities are the place of, the major cities are the place of innovation, the place the young people want to go, the place of investment, the place of higher wages, the place of higher real estate prices, the whole dynamic that we see, and even globally, that's what happens. And here I have to be a bit blue sky, because we, despite the incredible efforts the European Union has put into convergence, both politically and in terms of economic transfers, and that certain countries such as Germany or Italy have put in, or the UK for that matter, have put into their own regional, internal attempts at regional convergence, it has not really happened. And we see this very much in the US as well. We see this in Japan as well. And you layer in demography of aging societies, and those divisions just become persistent. And so, to me, this is one of the great challenges. And unfortunately, I think it has to require this is what I mean about being blue sky, we have to think in a very different political terms. The EU is a union of states, a union of nation states, but ultimately it's about the benefit of EU citizens, EU human beings, EU individuals, not where these political lines were drawn 50, 100 years ago. And so at some point there has to be a recognition, and we need to figure out a way to deal with the idea that we can all list the regions, but certain regions are just never going to converge. And this is something which also shows up in the macro policy world I'm more often in, that I think part of the problems of the European crisis were because of the insistence that if we simply took a hard enough line, there would be convergence, or that there was a moral failing on the part of certain governments and peoples that if there wasn't convergence, it was because they didn't do what they should have done. And I think at some point, as I've been arguing for some time, you have to accept that. And so here I may be in a different place than, this is one of the few places where I think I might be in a different place than Dirk, and certainly than what the official sector demands on the Commission and on the OECD are, that there may not be any way to salvage some of these second-tier cities and some of these rural regions. It may have to be about you just try to look after the people and try to figure out how to buy them off so that their resentment does not block what goes on in the other parts of the country.
Thank you so much. My final question before we move on to the next panel has to do with the policy framework. Because Adam, you referred to the European semester, to the productivity boards that we have in Europe. But a lot of what you discussed in your interventions has to do with the broader policy framework, competition policy, what we do about the rising concentration. And also there was a question in Slido about the role of monetary policy in productivity issues. So, I mean, how much can we do within the European semester that you are greatly familiar with, and how much of a broader framework would we need to address these issues properly?
I mean, I think there is a lot that can be done in terms of European semester, as I tried to say in my remarks, that about streamlining and focusing the priorities, that the productivity aspect of long-term growth having to do with diffusion of technologies, having to do with improving dynamism, having to do with a green focus, arguably, to public investment, having to do with scaling up public investment. This list and focus, bringing those to the forefront of the semester, not so much changing the process, but changing some of the priorities and what's included, I think is very doable and very powerful. But of course, as you indicate, Pavel, it's not the whole game. And I'll be very interested in what Dirk has to say on this. From the sort of macro perspective, I mean, monetary policy, there is a tendency to blame everything on monetary policy. I tend to blame everything on bad lack of financial regulation. But Be that as it may, I think on the specific issue of productivity growth, it's very difficult to see monetary policy as anything other than, in a sense, a side effect victim of the technological diffusion slowdown. In other words, we have fundamentally low long-term rates, and that makes monetary and very low private sector appetite for certain kinds of investment. And that makes monetary policy much less effective and much more limited. So the final point I would make is where we look beyond, you talk about the councils and potentially maybe even a group of councils at the European level or a European council. I think the key thing there is to go along these policies that do both mitigation and adaptation, that are focused less on how do we get up the innovation rate necessarily, but how do we make the most of the innovations we've got, the most adaptation, the most diffusion of the innovations we've got.
And is affected by almost anything we're looking at in terms of economic policy. There's not much out of scope. There are probably some things that are more important than others, but you can find links to the productivity agenda in almost anything you're looking at. And we had a conversation in Sydney, for instance, on the role of housing markets for mobility. Well, it's not something which I think if you come from a productivity angle you would typically get to very quickly, but there are links that can be established in that area as well. So in a sense, I think we always have to, and from our perspective, one of the things you're looking at is the innovation diffusion agenda in terms of, well, the role of technology, because I think, and innovation more broadly, because in a sense that's underlying a lot of the things we're seeing. But then that whole process of business dynamism, regular sort of competition, those types of issues, those are very fundamental as well to all of it. So, but even things like, well, skills, labor markets, all of these things matter. So and that's the problem to some extent also with selling the productivity agenda and talking about the productivity agenda, because you can touch on so many different factors that matter. But if you want to think about that long-term growth agenda, then I think you need to think about productivity and the drivers of productivity and what you can do about that in policy terms as well. And in our work at the OECD, I mean, our Going for Growth agenda, which is something which we also do often for the G20, is very much about, well, what are some of the things you can do at the national level around this? And that's where I think the productivity boards in the EU are, I think, an interesting tool to try and take this agenda forward. And we will try to work with that as well at the OECD, because I think you need to take this really at the national level as well and see what you can do at the national level in different circumstances.
Right. Adam, Dirk, thank you so much. You got us off to an excellent start, defining all the relevant issues and providing also the conceptual framework, and even going beyond to some of the policy solutions that we might want to think about in the EU. So thank you so much.